And now we collect comments and questions from the floor. And please.
Thank you very much. Good two presentations. First presentation about local government. I would like to ask about liquidity risk of the local government. In case of central government, central bank can intervene. But in case of local government, who should supply liquidity to local government? And if it is too much, that will create moral hazard problem. So I'd like to ask about liquidity issues. Then second paper, it's a very interesting paper about machine learning. But when we talk about inflation, we look at unemployment, GDP gap, and import price and price expectations. So your results, how could we interpret compared with those Phillips curve type inflation expectation? Secondly, central bankers are often be interested in very quick, frequent data. But most of today's discussion is fiscal data, and quarterly or annual data may be enough. So could it be possible to utilize your machine learning model into local government prediction of default? If it is so, it will be very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for both presentations. I'm very familiar with her work, pioneering and extended from the sovereign to subnational. On the machine learning, I have a question that the economists the traditional macro forecasts are well known to be off the mark, right? It's like a mutual fund managers 75% underperform the market. And economists, recently, IMF just upended forecast. And surprisingly, the third quarter U.S. GDP is 3.3%. And French, the PMI last week become a highest since 2011. So given the discrepancy between what projection vis-a-vis the outcome, to what extent machine learning projections would greatly increase its accuracy vis-a-vis the traditional model, or inherently we're dealing with a very uncertain world that no matter what kind of modeling, they were always going to be inaccurate. So I just want to get some sense of it's very intimidating. Like they are going to replace so many economists, right? But maybe there's a hope that because of a tremendous uncertainty, that at a very macro level, that machine learning will always be produce suboptimal forecast. Just want to get your philosophical thoughts on this.
Thank you. Two very nice presentations. I had a sort of couple of questions and comments sort of more generally on the public debt or local debt sustainability and management. In many of these, particularly infrastructure expenditures, we look at the rate of return, the expected rate of return and against the costs, and essentially if the rate of return is greater than the interest rate, it's worth doing, and if it's not, then not. But in looking at the rate of return or the benefits, there are some projects that are so large and so transformative that it's not clear that you can do a sensible kind of cost-benefit analysis. If you think of, let's say in the U.S., the Grand Coulee Dam or the Hoover Dam or the Golden Gate Bridge, I'm not sure that if you'd done an ex-ante cost-benefit analysis, you would have built any of these. But afterwards, the geography changes, and it becomes worthwhile. So this is an issue that kind of comes up quite often, either at the sovereign level or at the local government level, particularly in low-income countries, where big projects might be several percent of GDP, and in doing the debt sustainability analysis, there's essentially no way of knowing whether you should take on the debt and do this or not. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. On the machine learning, very interesting talk. I would as you well know, there are many pitfalls, and one of them is this sort of out-of-sample testing. So after the global financial crisis, we developed this vulnerability model for advanced economies. We put in housing prices. We estimated it through 2006. And then, indeed, for 2008, it predicts a crisis in the countries that had crises, and we were all very happy. And then we realized that the only reason we ever put in house prices in the model at all was because we knew what had happened. So, that's that problem. And finally, just mention one other thing. You have to be a little bit careful on who is reading your work, Andreas, because about a decade ago I wrote a thriller in which terrorists use a neural network to predict exchange rates and launch speculative attacks. So we wish you the best of luck in your work, but let's hope it's not abused. Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Pon Pen from the Bank of Thailand. I have a question for Andreas about machine learning too. I'm just curious to know whether you have any analysis on the impact of e-commerce data on inflation dynamics. Just want to learn more about this issue. And on my second question is about your slide that you show activation structure. I'm just want to learn more because usually unemployment and employment is mirror of each other. But in your slide, I mean, there are different views of unemployment and employment after global financial crisis. So I just want to ask for your explanation. Thanks.
Okay, so I'd like to presenters to respond to the question.
Thank you. So let me first come to you and thank you for looking at the website and looking at the tool and going through that. Just to clarify, there are two tools. The one that you looked for is for the central government. So there is another tool for the subnational or the local government, the one that I presented, which has slightly less indicators because we don't deal with monetary policy. So that's probably one of the differences that you felt. Your question is really valid in terms of is it theory or best practice, and how did we arrive at particular indicators. So when we were doing this work, as Lily mentioned, we looked at what is the guidelines on public debt management. So these are established guidelines that the bank and the fund developed them, but also signed off by over 180 countries that have agreed that these are the key elements for debt management. So we took those guidelines and then we sat with a group of people who have worked in debt management. We had somebody from the Swedish office, from the New Zealand, from Australia, from Brazil, and India, then from European countries, etc. So we went with different people and sat down and then looked at each of these indicators, how it would work. We also went and did 5 pilots. So we did a pilot in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, in Lima, in Peru, in Dikia, Jakarta, a municipality. Then we did for Indian states. We did for Nigerian states. So we did these pilots to sort of make sure that we come to some kind of a consistent approach. So across regions and across different income levels. That's how we did it. Now, if you look at it, it does look a bit contradictory that why should you give a best score for a subnational which is able to produce an auction calendar 3 months in advance as compared to 1 week? It's because of the ability to forecast. If you have a good forecasting ability, you can go 3 months ahead, but if not, you'd be just doing it for a week. So things like that were kept in mind when you were doing the gradation. Of course, nothing is perfect and things keep changing. Since we developed the tool, we've already revised it twice. Because as you work with other countries, you get much more data, and that definitely does happen. Then you had a question regarding how could you use more complicated instruments like PPP and debt financing platforms and off-balance sheet items. So the tool basically focuses on loans. It also focuses on market borrowings and other instruments, but it will not cover off-balance sheet items. Because what the tool does is that it looks at what is in the remit of the local government. So what the local government has on its books is what it's going to assess. What is off the balance sheet or what is with an SOE or an SPV, that will not be checked. What it would definitely check is the procedures for that, but it would not be able to assess in terms of how they are managed by another entity. So that's kind of, it will draw a line. So right in the beginning, it would tell you where it is. You also raised a really valid point that, the procedure could be correct, but what's the result? And that's something we faced a lot, that what are we coming out with this indicator set? Is it outcome-based? Is it output-based? So it's a question, if I could just take an example, is that when you go to give malaria drugs, so the mere fact of the distribution of the drug is not enough, but the reduction in the disease is important, right? And it may not necessarily be because you gave the drugs. It could be that people just decided to be more careful and more healthy, and so they didn't get malaria. So it's the same thing here, that it's hard to determine that just because the procedure or the legal framework is correct, that the local government will not get into a crisis. So it's hard to determine that. But you know for sure that if the procedure or the legal framework or the documents are not there, chances of getting into crisis or creating some risk is much higher. So that's the logic with which you work, and you try to make sure prudent steps are followed. That's the way it is. Yeah, you were asking about the issue about publications. Even if the local government's debt is controlled by the center, her question was, should it be published or not? My question to you back is that whose debt is it? If it's the debt of the local government, it's an obligation of the local government to publish, even if the debt is controlled by the center. There's no reason not to publish. So transparency is super important there. And thanks for your suggestions regarding, innovative instruments for financial management through debt, interest, and tax revenue. I forgot to add that in addition to the DEMPA tool, we also have what is the debt sustainability tool. So if I could just take an analogy, if you think of a cake, the size of the cake is like the size of the debt. It's determined by fiscal policy. It's your revenue and expenditures. And the tool to assess that whether that size of the cake is too big or too small, is your debt sustainable or not, is what we use as the debt sustainability framework. So that's another tool which we use to apply. And how is the cake composed of? Is it made up of chocolate or, strawberry or vanilla? We use the debt strategy in terms of the borrowing. Like, what is the composition of the borrowing? Is it short-term, long-term debt? Is it external or domestic? And how does the cake look? Is it baked correctly? Has it got the right looks? And is it cooked properly? Is the DEMPA tool. So we have these 3 different tools that we use in the bank, essentially to look at things. So we do look at the issue of, debt interest to tax revenue, debt to GSDP ratios, debt service to revenues, debt service to exports. So all those things are definitely looked at, because that's super important. But that's the area when we talk about fiscal policy and fiscal rules into that. And I think your question on pro-cyclicality is mainly on that, because that's related to fiscal policy. While the DEMPA tool is really looking at the issue of coordination with fiscal policy, that is this done in the right fashion or not? Would it affect or would it create any kind of issues on that? You also said whether we could expand it into macroeconomic and take inflation rate, etc. I think the power of this tool has been that it's very focused, and that's why we've worked with over 78 national governments, and it's remained small and focused. We work on a certain area, and that's what the focus was. But we have other tools which would deal with these issues of inflation rate, etc., especially the medium-term debt strategy tool. That would work on exchange rates, inflation rates, and the macro framework for the particular local government. So we would keep that very much in mind. Dean Yoshino's question on liquidity risk is a really interesting question. And as you asked me, I kept thinking about it. And I think that from my side, I guess there's no real answer to it, but then I would think it's the banker. So I would say that if a subnational gets into a liquidity problem, who is the banker to the subnational? The banker should then provide overdraft or credit facilities. So if I was working in Nigeria, the Nigerian states keep their money with commercial banks, but those commercial banks lend them as overdraft facilities. If I was working in India and Pakistan, they keep their money with the central bank. So then the central bank has ways and means facilities and overdraft facilities. A pretty structured facility is provided. If, again, DKI Jakarta, it keeps it with the commercial bank and it has a big surplus. So, that's the thing. So I would say that essentially, and same thing with Brazil, Rio de Janeiro state actually keeps it with in fact, part of the crisis that arose was because the state governments in Brazil were keeping their accounts with state-owned banks. And, there was this kind of cross-tipping between the two. So they are the ones which lend to them. So in that sense, to me, it would be the banker, not the central banker necessarily, whoever is the banker. That they should have the obligation to provide the liquidity support. Rex, on your question, that's a hard question to answer. I don't really have an answer because we are dealing with a similar situation right now in Gambia where there's a question of electricity company. Electricity or oil company, these are big projects, and really they do upset the debt sustainability. Like they would, if that kind of a loan is taken, it just makes it into high risk of debt distress, and then you trigger in all kinds of things. But unless you take that big a loan or you go for it, you can't really make development happen. So that's a big question, and I guess it's more so in a local government. But most of the local governments would then turn to the central government to provide the counter guarantee. But it's really a very valid question. I really don't have an answer. I would have turned to you for an answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good. So first, thanks for the detailed discussion. So I think you expressed many things much clearer than I did. So I think this was very, very helpful. So I got a lot of points here. So I thought I tried to group them together in three different categories. First, talking about the technical question, technical details, and just mention a couple of things I haven't said because of the because of the kind of brevity I wanted to keep it, but just to mention them for completeness. Then I will talk a bit about the more operational questions, and at the end more on the philosophical parts. How, for example, how does this relate to judgmental macroeconomic or standard macroeconomic modeling? Because it definitely touches on similar subjects. So on the operational side. You mentioned that I used small data. That's definitely correct, and I don't know if I mentioned it. So I want to say that small data are definitely also okay here. One just has to be careful what kind of model you use. For example, artificial neural networks, particularly usually large data set, but can also be used. But for example, support vector machines are particularly good also for small data sets and actually don't work very well with large data sets. Time modeling, also correct. So to say, most of these techniques have been developed for cross-sectional data analysis, and that's why we use this LELEC structure. Just for completeness, there are explicit models for to take time into account in a machine learning setup. They are called, for example, recurrent neural networks, online learning, or reinforcement learning. Then it's correct. Usually use the error as a evaluation criteria at the end. What lies at the heart of machine learning, also for completeness here, difference to econometrics. Econometrics, you usually try very hard to get an unbiased estimator, but we know in statistics that basically the error you get in the model is a decomposition of the best decomposition of the error and the variance, or the trade-off between the two, and that's probably and the machine learning basically tries to optimize this decomposition. This means machine learning estimators are often, say, biased, but have a much lower variance, leading to a higher R squared and better prediction at the end. So further on the model combination, this was just, I would say, also to Atish, your question, it was a little bit of a posteriori construction. because we saw that these models just react completely opposite to the crisis, and then we just saw what happens if you just put them together in a unweighted model forecast. Do you see actually any substantial improvement? And yes, so I would want to say on this side, definitely, if you want to operationalize such things, you have to do more rigorous assessment of this thing. It was just like a trial and error, and it was no error, so it worked quite well in this case, but this may not be the general thing. What do we have? Yeah, then the question on unemployment and employment rate, also more technical one, is that one was taken in changes like the employment and the other in levels. So we wanted to take both of them, like the changes and the level, into account, and what is important for changes in inflation. We also find if you take either of them in changes or level, they're kind of substitute each other to some extent. Now on the operational side, your question on if this could be used for example, modeling local government debt, and I think this was one of the reasons why I talked here. The answer is yes. It's a flexible framework. This means if you believe there is some relation in the data, which I guess every modeler assumes before starting out in the first place, you can use it. And I think there is, at least in terms of getting accurate numbers and predictions, certainly potential there. On the other hand, two more operational things is on, say, debt management, or on the operational side, I think machine learning can also be used for designing operational frameworks. This means, for example, getting data in, somehow processing them automatically. For example, we are trying it, part also of the working paper on, for example, banking supervision, because it's often a very straightforward, simple task. If you just have the balance sheet and you try to identify certain outliers, which, for example, for manual inspection, and I think such kind of frameworks can also be used for debt management, because there are certain similarities between these problems. And so, another question on also more operational in e-commerce. I don't have an answer for this because we haven't looked at e-commerce, but I think if you believe you find a signal there, which I think could definitely make sense, I would just try it out. So there's a little bit of a difference there, because we use a very small data set. If you deal with data from e-commerce, you're very likely to get a very, very large data set. On the one hand side, it's very granular. And then you have to think about how to model this. For example, in a machine learning setup, if you have a very granular data set, I think artificial neural networks are like a very, very good choice, at least to try. And I think they're also very much on the research academic frontier here. If you get them, say, running in a good way. On the other hand, the concern is, of course, as I mentioned in the presentation, the representative of your data set, because any e-commerce data set, I think, will be systematically biased, because you're not necessarily capturing the whole population of commerce, so to say, or of retail in general. So now, let me. I have one question I didn't get. What was your third point? Oh yes. So we used it also for for horizons between 1 quarter and 12. That's 3 years quarters, and it's I would say it's performing well on each horizons. There's of course certain variation. It performs better on the longer horizon because it gets more the smoother trends. But I think this is very normal for many time series forecasting, because on the short time horizon you often have to deal with a lot of noise, because the potential say noise to signal or signal to noise ratio is worse, so to say. But I think every model would have to say fight with these problems. So now let's come to the more philosophical or high level question on forecasting. And so there was two persons mentioned judgmental or structural based. Well, judgmental forecasts are often based on structural models. So frankly, we compared it to such models, but we didn't publish it because not because it would be somehow controversial, but because these kind of forecasts are not one-on-one comparable in how they're designed and how they're conducted and what the kind of data they take as an input. But just coming to the numbers and then also to the more, say, high level of philosophical points, is the forecasts were generally better. And there was a very simple reason for this, because when we talk about, say, conventional macro models and judgmental forecasts at, say, particular central banks, many of these models assume a certain inflation anchoring and a reversal to trend after a certain amount of time. And if this does not happen over a certain time horizon, which was the case for particularly many advanced economies in the last couple of years with subdued inflation, then these models just perform probably bad by construction. And if you take like a more agnostic modeling approach, which machine learning definitely is, you may not end up with this kind of pitfall. But even so, I want to emphasize again, there's no 100% comparison there, because in the judgmental forecast there goes much more information about the economy itself, its mechanisms and its different channels in, and they do not only forecast a number, but also a kind of upside and downside risks to the economy, which you wouldn't get any of those here in particular. Probably a comment on the Phillips curve. How it relates to this. So I would say you get certain Phillips curve relations in these models. They just, to some, what we found interesting, they probably look more, at least in the data we have, as more like an inverted Phillips curve. And particularly, I mean, there's I think more, I would say, a general discussion, or at least this is my personal view here. I would personally doubt, I say, usefulness of Phillips curves concepts, because they change over time, and there's a lot of discussions at the moment going on why the Phillips curve may have flattened in at least advanced economies. And I would say if you have a simple, say, relative linear relation between two variables, but this relation is somehow not stable over time, you're actually missing something. It's a little bit like trying to explain the volatility paradox by introducing a volatility smile and everything is nice again. And so I would say let me touch here on something which goes a little bit out of the machine learning concept and touches more on the general macroeconomic models. I would suggest alongside, for example, these non-structural machine learning models, where there could be part of like a modeling like set of family of models which then are used together. Another approach on the macroeconomic modeling side, which I think are able to give you very realistic, say, macroeconomic mechanisms and forecasts, are things like stock flow consistent models, which are very commonly used in the so-called post-Keynesian literature, and which are also, I think, very pragmatic and data driven approaches, because they're often embedded in a national accounting framework, and they could basically be used for advanced and emerging economies. And with these comments, I would like to thank everybody again and conclude.
Thank you very much. So I close the session, and thank you for all excellent discussions of presenters and discussants and the floor. Thank you very much.